So, without further ado, let me introduce you Professor Alireza Doostdar. The title of his lecture for today is Islam, Science, and the Gender of Reason. Please help me welcome.
Thank you, Sajjad, for that wonderful invitation. Thank you to various conspirators, organizers, facilitators at the university for this invitation. It's really a pleasure to be here. Thank you all for coming and avoiding this beautiful day. I know it won't last long here. So as you just heard, I recently completed a book on occult exploration and spiritual experimentation in modern Iran. The book examines a range of ways in which Iranians have rationalized the spiritual, the domain of the spiritual, what is often called the metaphysical. Since the early 20th century, that is how they've attempted to bring their spiritual inquiries in line with the dictates of reason and the frameworks of modern empirical sciences. At the heart of these attempts stands an image of so-called gullible women, zanan sadelo, a category of social persons who must be reformed or excluded if rational understanding of the spiritual is to become possible. While the circumstances of Iranian women have undergone drastic transformations over the past century, among other things, they're more educated, publicly visible, and socially active than at any other time in history, the figure of the gullible woman still erupts into public discourse from time to time. In my presentation, I'll examine this image in relation to a series of shifts in forms of spiritual inquiry and the social context within which they are pursued. My argument, in brief, is that the gullible woman stands in for two very different sets of anxieties at the two ends of the 20th century. By understanding these anxieties, we can gain analytic purchase on the ways in which hegemonic forms of rationality have been constituted and the specific challenges and resistances that they have engendered. I want to begin by describing an exorcism that I observed in December 2008. And this is in the introduction of my book too, if you want to read the fuller version. The setting was a condominium on the 4th floor of a newly completed apartment building in a middle-class residential neighborhood in eastern Tehran. There were about 30 people in attendance, all of them adults, and roughly 2/3 of them women. The atmosphere was welcoming and exuberant, if a bit awkward, like a dinner party where half the guests don't know one another. Most of the participants were students in a series of seminars teaching a form of spirituality and alternative therapy dubbed cosmic mysticism, or interuniversalism. So what you see here is the emblem of the group. And the reason that it's in English is that they also have an English-speaking audience. One of their bigger contingents right now is actually in Los Angeles. The lead exorcist, Mr. Sheda, was an instructor or master in cosmic mysticism, whom I met only a week earlier when I registered for his seminars. He tried to hold these therapy sessions at least once a week, each lasting up to 4 hours, depending on the number of participants. The cosmic mystics called their therapeutic practice defensive radiation, or Simontology, that's their word. In each of the sessions, Mr. Sheda was aided by a handful of student exorcists, both men and women, and they often worked on more than one patient at the same time, sometimes even alternating positions as healer and patient. The same person who was being exorcised one moment might then act as an exorcist the next moment. One of these student exorcist patients was Zainab, a woman in her early 30s who had begun attending the cosmic mysticism seminars shortly after a painful divorce. She underwent some of the most violent possessions that I witnessed during my fieldwork. In the presence of the other exorcists, Zainab routinely entered states in which she thrashed about, kicked and stomped, screamed, growled, burped, wept, gagged, spat, and moaned. She alternated between pleading with her exorcists and threatening them in a deep, gravelly voice. Her face contorted, eyes crossed, hair sweaty, and fingers gnarled like the claws of a menacing beast. Mr. Sheda and his assistants responded to all of this with gentleness and methodical care. They told me that Zainab had been possessed by legions of what they called inorganic viruses, and they waged war against them with an arsenal of words, gazes, gestures, and touch. The efficacy of their treatment, they said, depended on a form of cosmic energy that connected individual exorcists to the so-called universal intelligence that was the source of all healing. Their therapeutic knowledge and technique was obtained through mystical connection to this universal intelligence, but also confirmed, they said, through empirical scientific investigation. Hence, they classified radiation into different types and intensities, from -1 radiation control to defensive +4, all of which had to be activated through verbal utterance. Over time, the cosmic mystics disseminated these descriptions in their lectures and internal publications, but also in the form of books, conference papers, and even patent applications. So this is a patent application that's still active, the last time I checked, with the US PTO. Cosmic mysticism has attracted thousands of followers over the past decade, both in Iran and among the diaspora in North America, Europe, and elsewhere. The group is only one of many spiritual therapeutic movements to have emerged recently, and my book charts the wider terrain of experimentalism within which they are situated. While generating considerable appeal, alternative spiritual groups have also invited a substantial amount of controversy. Religious leaders and journalists have criticized their claims as pseudoscientific and their spiritual practices as irrational and downright dangerous. These critics have frequently singled out gullible women as the primary victims of spiritual imposters who drive them to religious deviance and sin. The causes of these women's gullibility are sometimes psychologized, sometimes rendered a matter of sociological explanations, and at other times articulated in terms of deficiencies in religious observance. So here what you see is a silhouette of Muhammad Tahiri, who's the founder of cosmic mysticism, and he's exercising a young woman, and he's saying, "Hey Jinn, move away from this beautiful lady." So there's obvious kind of connotations of sexual abuse and so on. And then on top it says, Tahiri did not adhere to Islamic mores, even those that restrict touching the bodies of unrelated women. Now what he faces is, first of all, that exorcisms rarely happen in private. They're usually semi-public events. There's many people present. And secondly, that women also exorcise men, men exorcise men, and women exorcise women. So that it's not as a straightforward kind of gender distinction as they set up. And then on this side, we have a middle-aged woman coming home to talk to her husband, and she's showing a certificate she got. I have one of these myself. And she's saying, "Look, honey, I've become a mystic and knower of God." So Arif Podashanas, one who knows or understands God. And here's my certificate. And the man is saying, "What? You become a mystic after only 8 terms." And that's a reference to the 8-term cycle. So there's 8 terms within cosmic mysticism. You basically register. There's no exams. By the end of it, you get a certificate. So that's kind of making fun of that. The figure of the gullible woman has long served as a foil. Oh, and sorry, to go back to that image briefly, what this completely ignores is the fact that A, it's not just women who take these classes, and B, that couples often go together. So again, there's not such a straightforward division between the rational man and the irrational woman, wherever you put that dichotomy. So the figure of the gullible woman has long served as a foil for dominant conceptions of reason. Over the course of centuries, philosophers, scientists, and guardians of Islamic orthodoxy cast a disapproving gaze at women's unreason, while attempting to construct rational accounts of reality. For these thinkers, womanly nonsense encompassed everything from ridiculous stories about animals to silly tales passed off as history and fantastic delusions about astrology and witchcraft. Beginning in the second half of the 19th century and continuing well into the 20th, Iranian modernist intellectuals laid siege to the so-called delusions of commoners, and especially traditional women, as obstacles to progress and nationalist renewal. Some of these intellectuals identified womanly superstitions as spurious accoutrements to a true Islam, while others equated Islam itself with superstition. The Shi'i Muslim clergy usually bore the brunt of the modernist attacks as those most directly responsible for oppressing women and keeping them backward and benighted. To eliminate superstition, their critics held, women needed to be educated and set free from the shackles of traditional society. So what you see here, and it's also on the cover of the book, is a painting currently in a private collection in New York. which is probably by either Kamal al-Mulk, this really famous court painter, or somebody in his circle. And what it's showing is an occult specialist who could act as an exorcist, but also as kind of an unwitcher of sorts, who is using his power to call jinn in order to discover and cancel the witchcraft, probably afflicting one of these women, and I'm pretty sure it would be the younger girl. So it's probably the man, the cleric, and his wife are probably here to check why the younger girl is experiencing misfortunes. Maybe she's not getting married, maybe she has a bad husband, and so on and so forth. So the painting, what is actually the style of this painting? There's been discussion of it probably being a kind of a social satire, even though it's done in a realist genre. There are fantastical elements with the jinn, and it's probably making fun of the superstitions of commoners, and here making the cleric an accomplice, right? So a kind of a division between the men and the women, the men sort of subjugating and taking advantage of or duping the women. The mainstream Shi'i clergy were not silent before these sorts of attacks. They were both anxious to defend their positions of social and intellectual prestige, and annoyed that their scholarly achievements were being equated to the ignorance of uneducated women. To defend Shi'i doctrines, they went to great lengths to show that Islam was hospitable to science and reason. One of the most vigorous of these defensive battles was waged by Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, the Islamic jurist, who would go on to lead the revolution in 1979 and establish the Islamic Republic. Around 1944, Khomeini wrote a ferocious polemic responding to a series of attacks by a handful of anti-clerical intellectuals. In his defense of Islamic doctrines, he deployed theological, philosophical, and jurisprudential reasoning and marshaled a wide range of evidence, from the Quran and prophetic traditions to the claims of European scientists. In doing so, Khomeini took pains to distance the clergy from certain beliefs and practices that he acknowledged as superstitious. For example, he argued that those who consulted exorcists, fortune tellers, and the like, that is, the gullible women whom the modernists sought to rescue, were clearly not the pious people who had close contact with the clergy, because the clergy considered such practices to be forbidden. With a hint of exasperation, he wrote, quote, "What are the poor mullahs to do when they have always been opposed to these sorts of nonsense?" The same went for people venerating trees or stones, or enthralled by fantastic tales told by vagrant storytellers. Again, the kinds of practices routinely attributed to women. The clergy and those who interacted with them, argued Khomeini, were the last to believe these kinds of things. Now, as late as the mid-20th century, when Khomeini wrote his treatise, the controversy between the Shia scholars and their modernist critics turned in part on a question over who had closer access to women for the sake of reforming them. The modernists were arguing that women were ignorant because the clergy had kept them in the dark, whereas the clergy were responding that if women were ignorant, it was because the clergy could not reach them. The figure of the gullible woman, that is, stood as an index of the failure of elites, whether clerical or anti-clerical, to reach their flock. By the end of the 20th century, matters were dramatically different. As a result of policies instituted in the Pahlavi era and expanded with some adjustments under the Islamic Republic, women are now more educated than at any other point in history. Through compulsory education in primary and secondary schooling and the widely accessible post-secondary system, both women and men are trained in traditional Islamic forms of reasoning, like theology, as well as being exposed to a range of other intellectual disciplines, from engineering and the natural sciences to the social sciences and humanities. According to most assessments, women now comprise over half of all university students, including in the scientific fields. And while the traditional Shi'i seminary system remains dominated by men, there too, opportunities for women's learning has multiplied in recent decades. And yet, in spite of all these transformations, the figure of the gullible woman still commands attention from time to time. How can this be? To understand the continued relevance of this figure, we need to understand certain epistemic shifts in the domain of spiritual inquiry over the past half-century. In brief, I want to argue that the proliferation of scientific articulations of spirituality has led to a kind of democratization of rational spiritual intellection. To the guardians of traditional Shi'i rationality, the democratization this democratization presents both opportunities and challenges. On the one hand, it has fostered the emergence of new forms of argumentation in defense of orthodox doctrine. On the other hand, these newly available styles of reasoning have sometimes supported unorthodox conclusions. As such, the rise of scientific and experiential spirituality produces the threat of what some Islamic scholars understand as epistemological anarchy. The figure of the gullible woman functions as a convenient stand-in for the dangers of anarchy. But here, the gullible woman no longer indexes a population that is out of reach to the clergy's pedagogical enterprise. In reality, her figure refers to a public that has come into being precisely through a decades-long campaign to inculcate a modernizing, science-minded Islamic reason. In a sense, then, the gullible woman of the early 21st century is a product of the thoroughgoing success of the Islamic Republic, or perhaps a product of its having been all too successful. I'm just going to take my jacket off. To properly appreciate the shifts of the past few decades, we first have to understand that there are different paths for rational spiritual inquiry. Some of these are characterized by a commitment to scripturalist understanding, that is, looking to the foundational texts of Islam for guidance in distinguishing truth from falsehood and the permissible from the forbidden. Within these scripturalist approaches, there are orientations that are centered in the Quran and prophetic traditions, and others that take their departure from the Quran but proceed according to a tradition of rationalist theology with debts to the ancient Greeks. Yet another form of spiritual rationality might be called spiritual empiricism. In the broadest sense, spiritual empiricism comprises those attitudes that take human perceptions, observations, and experiments seriously as legitimate means to spiritual truth. I use the term as a way of organizing ethnographic and historical data on the ways in which people acquire knowledge of the spiritual world and reflect on their relationship with immaterial existence. As such, spiritual empiricism should not be subsumed under the European philosophical movement that we might call empiricism with a capital E, even though some of the orientations I discussed have directly or indirectly been influenced by this intellectual current. A corollary of this point is that the term spiritual empiricism does not identify a comprehensive epistemological position, but only one component in various epistemological systems dealing with relations between observable reality and the invisible world. I should also emphasize that I'm not arguing that spiritual empiricism is exclusively modern. There's a whole range of ways in which pre-modern thinkers, including theologians, philosophers, and mystics, drew on the data of the senses as well as experiential or visionary forms of knowledge. My interest lies primarily in the historical entanglement of older forms of spiritual empiricism with newer orientations, especially the ways in which the modern empirical sciences have inflected, refracted, and reshaped spiritual understanding. Earlier in the 20th century, when the clergy began to defend their intellectual traditions against anti-clerical attacks and against accusations of duping gullible women, they looked to the modern empirical sciences as potential resources for articulating a newly rationalized theology. Ayatollah Khomeini's 1944 treatise, which I already mentioned, provided one influential contribution to this trend. In one section of his book, this is the Kashf al-Asrar, the unveiling of secrets. In one section of his book, dedicated to a defense of the permanence of the soul, Khomeini made a philosophical and scientific case largely drawn on non-Islamic sources. He began by citing evidence from the Quran, but then moved on to enumerate the views of a range of philosophers: Thales of Miletus, Anaximenes, Empedocles, Pythagoras, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, Avicenna, Sohrawardi, Mullah Sadra, and he actually quoted all of them, like a paragraph or two for each. And Descartes, finally arriving at modern European spiritists, mesmerists, and psychical researchers. Of the latter he wrote, "Magnetism, or magnetic sleep, has strongly shaken the world, and the materialists are breathing their last breaths. In the near future, science will completely lift the veil from this topic and will make manifest the world of spirits, their eternal life, and their strange phenomena, such as the insensitivity to pain of those in magnetic sleep, and their reports of the invisible, and hundreds of other astonishing secrets. This science will forever remove the foundations of materialism from the world. A bit optimistic, but still. As an example of astonishing spiritual manifestations, Khomeini cited an incident that allegedly involved the 19th century French neurologist and psychical researcher Jules Bernard Louis. He wrote, "Louis, who is a famous hypnotist, put a woman to sleep in the presence of a group and told her to go home and see what people were doing there. The sleeping woman said, 'I went there. 2 people are doing the house chores.' Louis told her to put her hand on the body of one of them. At this point, the sleeping woman laughed and said, 'I put my hand on one of them as you ordered me to do,' and they were very scared. Louis asked those present if anyone knew the woman's house. One said that they did. He asked them to go to her house and see if the story was correct or not. They went and saw that the residents of the house were in fear and panic. They asked the reason and were told that they had seen a figure in the kitchen that moved and put a hand on someone there." Now, one of the many fascinating aspects of Khomeini's appeal to empirical science is that it does not easily cohere with a long-entrenched Shi'i theological standpoint on the soul's immateriality. While he drew on classical Islamic epistemological categories to make his case, Khomeini's acceptance of sensory evidence for the existence of disembodied spirits marked a radical departure from accepted doctrine. His theological epistemology, that is, expanded and contorted in the process of citing empirical evidence. This experimental openness toward the spiritual possibilities of modern science has gained significant appeal over time. We can see a similar sensibility at work in an account that one of my interlocutors shared with me on the mechanisms of divine reckoning. Dr. Ali Mowahid, an electrical engineer and former university professor, told me that he had performed a set of calculations to show that it was possible for a human being's good and evil deeds to be recorded within a portion of his or her own bodily substance. This data, he said, might later be retrieved in the afterlife for the final judgment. The idea had come to Dr. Mowahid in a friendly gathering some years earlier when a staunch materialist among the guests, one of his friends, ridiculed Islamic representations of Judgment Day. Specifically, the guests sneered at the idea that there were 2 angels appointed for every human being to record his or her deeds in minute detail. Upset at the man's mockery, Dr. Mowahid performed a few quick calculations in his head. He then told the guest that it was completely unnecessary to imagine anthropomorphic angels sitting on people's shoulders and writing down their actions. A person's deeds could instead be numerically encoded in a tiny fragment of the human body and its very electrons. Later, he performed the calculations in greater detail on his computer and sent me, by email, a Microsoft Excel sheet with the details. Dr. Mowahid explained the numbers to me like this. Let's take the typical human lifespan to be 80 years. In microseconds, that would be about 2.5 times 10 to the power of 15 seconds. Now let's say that we were to score the person's behavior, or even thought process, every microsecond, that is, every millionth of a second, assigning at each moment a numerical value between, let's say, 0 and 1,000. It's digital humanities. We would need 10 bits of information to represent each such value. So for a total lifespan, we would need about 2.5 times 10 to the power of 16 bits. To store such data, we could use electrons, with the assumption that the spin direction of each electron can store 1 bit of information. That is, we would determine that a spin up would equal a 1, and a spin down would be a 0. To record all the information, we would therefore require 2.5 times 10 to the power of 16 electrons. Using the Avogadro constant, we know that each microgram of hydrogen has 6.02 times 10 to the power of 16 electrons. He actually had that number in his head, the Avogadro constant. To store a lifetime's worth of information as we've defined it then, we would need approximately 0.04 micrograms of hydrogen from the person's body. If we imagine that after death, even only less than a tenth of a microgram of the hydrogen in the individual's body were to survive, we would still have enough to contain information on a lifetime of actions and thoughts. Despite the intricacy of his formulation, Dr. Mowahid emphatically denied that the model represented reality in any way. All I'm saying, he told me, is that it's possible to conceive of this aspect of the hereafter in a way that makes sense, given our current scientific knowledge. That is, his empiricism consisted not so much in establishing a direct evidentiary connection between observable reality and empirical truth and spiritual truth, as instead looking to persuasive representations of physical reality, those of particle physics, in order to imagine a more plausible model of metaphysics than that which involves the anthropomorphisms of angels and demons. In the hands of intellectual elites like Ayatollah Khomeini and Dr. Mujahid, scientific empiricism has been made to serve a universalizing, rationalist Islam, which can be clearly distinguished from the nonsense of intellectual inferiors like the gullible women dear to the modernist anti-clericals of the early 20th century. Over time, however, similar argumentative strategies have become available to non-elites, including young women trained in the modern empirical sciences. So let me give you a few examples. In 2004, a female high school student in Tehran named Hamideh Bitaraf won the prestigious Khwarazmi Award in chemistry for a project titled The Testimony of Water. And she was one of 30-something, I think, winners of that prize. Aiming to demonstrate the, quote, interactions of the world of spirituality and the corporeal world, Bitaraf tested the effects of various sounds and written words on the microscopic structures of ice, mercury, copper sulfate, and a tin alloy. She found that ice crystals exposed to religious texts, like the Untitled Chapter of Quran, appeared slanted, while texts that carried good concepts, like love and friendship, made the crystals round, and texts expressing negative concepts, like hatred, elongated them. In her abstract, Bitaraf wrote that her project demonstrated, quote, the delicate and sensitive microscopic mechanical effects of the environment arising from the wave-like effects radiating from the spiritual states of the human actor on another material substance, which appears in the form of a new metaphysical phenomenon, end quote. Her project has been cited numerous times online, often as empirical demonstration of a well-known verse from the Quran. Whatever is in the heavens and on earth does declare the praises of God. What we see in this example is a diffusion of spiritual empiricism beyond elite scholarly circles, even as the scientific experiment self-consciously serves an orthodox Islamic project. This form of diffusion has become possible in part through the expansion of mandatory public schooling and the valorization of modern scientific learning. Young women like Hamideh Bitaraf have been a key demographic target of this education, such that, as I mentioned, they now comprise over half of all university students. The proliferation and popularization of scientific imaginaries, then, has offered an opportunity for young women to join their male counterparts in advancing the project of rationalist Islamic orthodoxy. But there's also a challenge to this proliferation, to the extent that it can serve spiritual commitments other than those of Orthodox Shiism. Bitaraf's experiments were inspired by the Japanese author Masaru Emoto, several of whose books have been translated to Persian. These texts gained widespread appeal in the mid-2000s at a time of rising demand for motivational and self-help literature, particularly those that couched spiritual advice in a scientific idiom. Encouraged by a process of economic and cultural liberalization at the end of the 8-year war with Iraq, works of alternative spirituality from novels and short stories by Paulo Coelho and Gibran Khalil Gibran, to books on theosophy, New Thought, Buddhism, Krishnamurti, Carlos Castaneda, Scientology, and all manner of New Age titles translated from English or blended into eclectic local systems. The sheer multiplicity of the spiritual ideas on offer promoted an ethos of experimentation. We can see an example of this in an account that one of my interlocutors narrated to me about her spiritual journey. This was Alireza Doostdar, who was a middle-aged housewife living in an affluent neighborhood in western Tehran. As an eager storyteller, she shared some of the most intimate details of her life with me, couched within a narrative of spiritual journeying. At the time of our meeting, Doostdar was 8 months into her study of cosmic mysticism, having continuously taken classes with Mr. Sheda, the exorcist I introduced at the beginning of this presentation. She described these 8 months as a period of healing and spiritual uplift, following upon years of crisis, illness, and depression. To Doostdar, they had been the culmination of various struggles in her life, which she had waged with loving faith in God, a voracious appetite for reading, and a trust in the intuitions of her heart. Doosdar's father was a practicing Sufi and an officer in the Shah's army. She herself had not been much interested in religion until she had a vision one night of 2 glowing angels in her bedroom. As she explained it to me, the vision came to her after a period of marital crisis, and it stoked her interest in books about religion and metaphysics. She began with Buddhism, and practiced meditation for a while. She was enamored particularly with Bert Spalding's 1924 book, Life and Teaching of the Masters of the Far East, which was translated to Persian in 1997. It's an awe-inspiring book, Alireza Khanum told me. It's like the Quran for me. Whatever page you open the book to, you learn something. Later on, she read about Christianity and even considered conversion after repeated viewings of a Persian Christian satellite channel. She read other spiritual literature as well, including Paul Twitchell's The Tiger's Fang on Ekankar and Mohsen Farshad's The Quantum Thoughts of Maulana Rumi, which attempts a synthesis of Sufism and quantum mechanics. These inquiries would gradually set the stage for Alireza Khanum's embrace of cosmic mysticism. In particular, she would be primed by her familiarity with various formulations of ideas about a cosmic intelligence that ostensibly ruled the entire universe. Alireza Khanum's visions also opened her mind to scientific truths, particularly in the realm of quantum physics. I didn't even know what physics was before this, she told me. But now I can understand if two physicists sit here and talk to one another. Not that I've become a know-it-all, but I've understood what quantum physics is, for instance, without anyone explaining it to me. What it talks about, what it relates to. I felt it without having studied it, that everything, every cell, every moment is different from the one before it. Every state is different from the one before it and after it. Alireza Khanum's spiritual experiments increasingly distanced her from the orthodox form of Shiism dominant in the Islamic Republic, but she ultimately viewed her path in relativistic terms, as something that was suitable for her and that won the approval of her heart. For others among my interlocutors, scientific spirituality can function explicitly as an instrument for fashioning an anti-Islamic subjectivity. An example of this was Mirsadeh, a self-described witch whom I interviewed in 2008. At the time, Mirsadeh was a 24-year-old master's student in psychology who lived and worked in a middle-class neighborhood in western Tehran. Sometimes she received clients at a hole-in-the-wall cafe nearby where she interpreted their coffee grounds, performed tarot readings, and made appointments for more in-depth sessions at her suite. This is the cafe where she worked sometimes and read tarot, and this is the suite. For her witchcraft, Mirsadeh drew on a corpus of Islamic occult science available to her in the form of lithograph-printed grimoires, which are occult manuals, basically. These grimoires frequently incorporate invocations based on passages from the Quran and other Arabic supplications. Mirsadeh attested to the efficacy of these invocations. In fact, she told me that she had learned to read and understand the Arabic Quran not in public school, where she horsed around during class, but through her education in witchcraft. She explained the magical power of the Quran in terms of resonances and frequencies. Because Islamic prayers have been uttered for generations by supplicants seeking to satisfy some wish or other, these utterances have been ingrained in the cosmos as energetic resonances that reverberated whenever they were invoked with the requisite confidence and creative imagination. These energies, Mirsadeh said, followed what she called, quote, the general laws of physics, chemistry, psychology, and metaphysics. Mirsadeh's theory of witchcraft was a creative synthesis of her practical knowledge with her interpretation of Persian grimoires, material she had garnered from a Persian translation of the 1948 book, The Mirror of Magic, by the Swiss-American surrealist painter Kurt Seligman, and most importantly, Rhonda Byrne's 2006 film, The Secret, which you'll know about if you watch Oprah. A dubbed version of The Secret was first broadcast on Iranian state television and became an instant sensation, spawning a series of books, CDs, calendars, stationery, and other merchandise. In Mirsadeh's apt, if idiosyncratic formulation, The Secret was the foundation of both prayer and witchcraft. To explain it in very simple terms, she told me, all the world around us is energy. Witchcraft and prayer writing and talismans, all are energy. The energies that humans emit can be either positive or negative, and they remain in the world forever. Every prayer, wish, desire, and feeling has its own frequency. Say you want a Mercedes elegance car, which you did want. There's a wavelength to your desire that wells up from within you. This is what the cosmos hears and responds to. Now, even though Mirsadeh routinely employed Islamic supplications in her witchcraft, she dismissed Islamic theology as nonsense. She believed in a sort of pantheistic universal energy that encompassed everyone and everything, but thought the Quran and other holy books were man-made. She told me that she could open up the Quran on any page and point at a verse to tell me its specific problems. Have you ever heard of a female prophet, she asked me, All societies are patriarchal, she continued, because in every religious book, the prophets have always been men. They would enslave women or say that the women were to obey their husbands and other male authorities. For the guardians of Shi'i orthodoxy, people like Mirsadeh and Arzu Khanum are best understood as gullible women who've fallen prey to the deceptions of mystical pretenders. An example of this attitude can be seen in a book on spiritual wayfaring by Ayatollah Sheikh Hossein Mazahiri. In a section on, quote, avoiding satanic delusions, Mazahiri laments the explosion of what he calls false, newly emerging mysticisms that instigate delusions and hallucinations among young people and gullible women. The only way to avoid being duped by charlatans, he continues, is to adhere closely to the exoteric rules of the Islamic path and to consult the learned Islamic scholars who've succeeded in purifying their own souls. Among my interlocutors, there were women who strove to embody the pious sensibility that Mazahiri articulated. One of these interlocutors was Dr. Farah Adibi, a middle-aged assistant professor of English literature. I was interested in speaking with Dr. Adibi because I knew she had taken yoga classes, and I was curious to find out how she navigated her practices with reference to her pious Islamic commitments. She explained to me that she thought about these matters rationally. She considered herself constricted by a lock of reason, which in practice involved asking herself how any spiritual claim measured up against a single criterion. This is what she said. Is it compatible with the Quran and with reliable prophetic traditions? If she was convinced that this was the case, she said, the matter becomes etched in my heart. Otherwise, I automatically reject it and purge it from my mind. In the mid-1990s, Dr. Adibi had found occasion to deploy her criterion while attending yoga classes. She would go for the exercise, she said, but other things would happen there as well. For example, during relaxation exercises, the teacher would ask participants to close their eyes and focus their imaginations on her words, while calming music played in the background. Dr. Adibi had felt ambivalent about this. This is her quote. It wasn't bad, but after doing it 2 or 3 times, I thought to myself, I'm not really where they're telling me I am, lying on the beach, swimming in the ocean. You've all experienced this. What if these visualizations they're creating should become so powerful as to impact my soul and change it into something it's not? I immediately pull the handbrakes on myself. I don't allow myself to move past a certain limit, to fall prey to certain things. But some other people found great benefit in it. They would be helped and would turn into stronger people. Now, while Dr. Adibi's lock of reason prevented her from a total embrace of yoga, her understanding of spirituality could not be reduced to the doctrinal positions typically articulated as orthodox. For one thing, she told me that she understood spirituality to be universal. On a visit to India, she had picked up a copy of Sri Sri Ravi Shankar's Celebrating Silence, whose title had attracted her. Waiting at the airport on her way back to Tehran, she had initiated a conversation with an Indian university professor about the book. Their shared understanding of deep spiritual concepts had confirmed her belief in the universality of spiritual truth. When some individuals reach certain heights, she told me, there's a universality that takes shape. I think those who talk about globalization are misled. It's not about everyone following America. Globalization is when you read Shakespeare saying something at a spiritual height, and you see the same thing in Dante, and you see the same in Hafiz. This is globalization. It's a lofty doctrine. Dr. Adibi's example teaches us that commitment to the so-called straight path of rationalist orthodoxy can take myriad complex forms. Despite all her efforts then, it would not be difficult to imagine even Dr. Adibi being painted with the broad brush of gullibility. As I've shown, the anxiety about women's gullibility at one level reproduces the tropes of the early 20th century and even of the pre-modern period. At another level, it is born of recognition that women's increasing literacy and facility with modern scientific discourse has made a bewildering range of spiritual options available to them. The gullible woman, that is, no longer stands simply for the uneducated and ignorant, but instead for those whose learning has exposed them to a multitude of rationalizing discourses outside of the self-consciously Islamic. A slightly different way of explaining this anxiety is to say that it focuses on the proliferation of inappropriate modes of spiritual empiricism. It's not that Islamic scholars are opposed to empirical approaches to spirituality. As we've seen, appeals to scientific experience and empiricism are commonplace and often valorized. But in order to provide admissible evidence of spiritual truth, Islamic scholars increasingly recognize that empirical inquiry needs to be subjected to stringent disciplines and safeguards. These include not only commitment to Islamic ethical teachings, but also fidelity to the principles of rationalist theology. Without such protections, they fear that the pursuit of spiritual truth will lead to moral and epistemological anarchy. I think that there's still more at stake in singling out gullible women as the primary victims of spiritual deviance. Contemporary conceptions of Islamic rationality are bound up with ideas of progress, tied to a modern developmentalist imagination. For intellectuals committed to the Islamic Republic, the inculcation of Islamic reason both ensures the production of appropriate pious subjectivities and encourages social, scientific, and technological progress toward the establishment of an Islamic civilizational alternative to the modern secular West. Lingering anxieties about superstition gesture toward the incompleteness of this project. This incompleteness is feminized, even though men are subject to it too. What this seems to suggest is that a certain unmarked heteronormative masculinity sits at the center of idealized reason, a masculinity that has characterized modernist rationality since its inception in the 19th century. Women, in this view, are conceived as developable subjects of the state, where the latter is primarily imagined as rational, virtuous, and male. As developable subjects, women can be held up as exemplars of the success of the Islamic State's project of rationality, while also being disparaged as gullible subjects who yet require further intervention whenever the project fails. I suspect there's also kind of an anxiety about men being identified as the victims of superstition, because if rationality can't be anchored in the male subject, then where there is no anchor for it left, right? So at least with women, you can always say, women are developable. And so I want to conclude with a few brief remarks on the anthropology of reason. For some time now, anthropologists have bracketed questions of rationality in studying the religious or occult practices of others. There used to be fundamental questions, these used to be fundamental questions not only for anthropologists, but for philosophers and scholars of religion as well. A central concern had to do with how conceptions of rationality could serve cross-cultural comparison. Were there universal standards by which beliefs held by different groups could be compared? Or was rationality internal to specific phenomenological life worlds and the diverse language games that people played? How were scholars to make sense of what Dan Sperber called apparently irrational beliefs? For decades, such questions pitted universalists against relativists, intellectualists versus symbolists, and phenomenologists. These days, however, questions of rationality rarely inspire interest. There are good reasons for this, to be sure, not least of which is that anthropologists have helped us see some of the problems of the earlier debates, while steering us toward other kinds of questions. Tanya Luhrmann, for example, has invited us to be more attentive to the psychological complexities of both experience and the interpretation of experience, including acts of what she calls post hoc rationalization. Recently, some proponents of the so-called ontological term have called for abandoning epistemological concepts like belief and knowledge altogether, suggesting instead that we open ourselves up to our interlocutors' radically different ontologies and allow ourselves to be transformed by the possibilities these alternative realities offer. These approaches have all helped significantly clarify the terms of our arguments while opening up productive opportunities for research. But there's an assumption running through them that rationality is primarily a concern of the analyst rather than her interlocutors. What do we make of situations like those I've described in my presentation today, where rationality and affiliated notions like reason, intellect, science, and evidence appear as reflexive emic concepts tied to specific practices? I think that circumstances like these can provide rich opportunities for comparative anthropologies of epistemology, for understanding how people know things, how their forms of knowing are gendered or stratified in other ways, and how the conditions of their knowledge undergo shifts through time. They also enable us, I think, to appreciate the contingency of our interlocutors' lifeways, the historical accidents, as well as continuities that have made them into what they are today, and perhaps even some of the ways in which these contingencies and continuities are bound up with our own. Thank you. I'm happy to take questions. Yes,
Yeah.
right.
Should I take them first?
Whatever is fine. I mean, I can do this.
Okay.
I agree great talk. I have one question that I don't know if it may be just outside of your comfort zone. I guess reacting partially to the part of what you just said. I appreciate. I think what you're after, that you're in some ways getting at a kind of a study of rationality itself from, in some ways, a rational point of view. And I appreciate that, and I think what you're really after is rationality. But one thing you don't share, and I guess I'm going to reveal my hand, that's sort of part of the sort of interest in anthropology in the ontologicals. One thing I think you that separates you from these people is a certain kind of cynicism or skepticism. As much as you share rationality with them, you're also, in some ways, looking at this from a point of view, a critical point of view. And I guess as an imaginative experiment, I would ask you, what if you were to actually envision a rationalist conversation between Islam and science, in which something is produced other than something that could be a figure for a social movement, what might that be?
I didn't understand the last part.
So the question is, and this may be sort of, someplace that you can dodge this one, but you have to answer it. But I invite you to think of a conversation between Islam and science, which is not just simply, which could be a rationalist one, as you're saying, but in which the goal, from your point of view, is not only to see it as a figure for a rational. The role would not necessarily be just a rational role, to see it as a figure for a social, something that's happening.
Oh, you mean like the social in the sense of versus the natural and this kind
As
of
a socialist, that you're tracing, what you're doing is tracing something that's happening, a shift in society in Iran, right?
So to rephrase this, are you saying, could I imagine a rationalist conversation, the outcome of which could be my communication with a ghost, say?
Yeah, or something, or maybe take the example of the guy who's explaining how to store things in electrons, which seems really humorous and is sort of told that way. And could you imagine a conversation where somebody is getting at something that might actually force you to think about that?
Right. I think that conversation, actually humorous as it is, does get us to understand something, but maybe it's still within the realm of the social, in the sense that I think what it captures for me is the idea that a representation need not be persuasive only in terms of its fit, right, with kind of, it's sort of a kind of representational model of truth, right? Mm-hmm. That it's not it's its internal coherence and its fit with other conceptions that we have of the world, because what we're dealing with is so outside of our experience, there's nothing that actually can come to accurately representing it, right? Mm-hmm. So that for me is really interesting, because it has parallels, and there's a chapter where I kind of expand this a little bit more, but there's parallels with others who've made the attempt to think in terms of scientific models of the radically unknowable, and the way they recognize that they can't, there's no way that they can actually substantiate that representation in an empirical way, right? So the only way that they can do it is by making perhaps logical arguments, or by a sort of a process of exclusion, and there's a kind of a persuasiveness that's almost sui generis, it's internal to the model. So that I found super interesting, and it's very different from, say, kind of an empiricist. It's not strictly speaking empiricism, even though there's a certain kind of concern with empirical demonstrability outside of that. But to answer the first part of your question, I think the cynicism, I wouldn't say cynicism, I would say skepticism. The way I get around this problem is two things. One is the people I worked with were also skeptical. And there were all kinds of scenarios, situations where when I was engaged in conversation or in interviews, the person I was talking to was as much trying, it seemed to me, to convince themselves as they were trying to convince me. So I was kind of a sounding board, and I would kind of engage in conversation and debate and so on. But it was never, except in very rare circumstances, that I talked to someone who was completely, sort of sold on something. It's very rare. The other side of it is that the idea that I talked about this a little bit in the introduction. There were moments in the earlier part of my research where I kind of did take pretty seriously in a subconscious way, right? Not necessarily attesting to something in an explicit way, but subconsciously I was being affected by the stuff that I was studying. And I had nightmares, which I read about a little bit. And it happened in other times during my research, which I don't write about, but there were several times when I had nightmares. And I consciously decided I'm going to keep this stuff at an arm's length. Because if I don't, I'm going to go crazy, or other bad things might happen to me, and I'd rather be able to complete this and write a book and get a job. If somebody had done a kind of a more experiential project, I think that would have been perfectly, sound, and they would have come away with perhaps very different conclusions. So, the trick that I'm playing there, in which I don't know if it has a resolution or not, is to say that my kind of skeptical distancing came from fear and not from, what is it, legitimate true belief, right? Or justified true belief, right? The justified true belief was actually coming from a place of fear. So, I think that bridges this in some ways. That I don't think. As time went on, I could say that I was more skeptical of certain things that I was seeing than I was initially. I was more open to certain things, but I can't, in good conscience, say whether that was because I had primed myself for skepticism, or if it was actually the result of my empirical observations.
That's great.
Yes.
I don't know if I got this right in terms of my reading of what you were saying, but when you were talking earlier in the lecture about name, it seemed to me the arguments you were making that you have a set of positive orthodoxy, and there's almost an apologetic bent to what it's presenting in the unveiling secrets.
Unveiling secrets.
That line that's sort of one strategy in sort of looking at the relationship of sort of current contemporary context, the relationship of science and religion. But sort of the other elements you're describing, these fascinating movement to examine around, seem to be pushing what you're saying towards a more transformative understanding of the relationship of spirituality and science. They're not merely apologetic, but transformative, looking for some kind of, not just interface, but fusion between the domain of science and the domain of spirituality. Takes it a step further in a sense. Perhaps would they be analogous to in other traditions? I don't know, you think of Western theosophy or elements of Christian Science or elements within Buddhism that sort of seek that kind of, in the contemporary context, that fusion of science and religion, maybe even aspects of New Age, and you mentioned the influence of New Age.
Yeah.
But are these, is that one of the tensions playing out here?
Yeah. I think you're absolutely right about that. I would mitigate it a little bit by saying that with Khomeini and certain other clerical experiments, with things like seances with the dead, there's an original kind of apologetic impulse, but the outcome of that is not just apology. So it's hard to reduce it to a kind of a strategy when what results, for example, is speculation on whether in fact it is possible to communicate under certain experimental conditions with the souls of the dead. So that's, as far as I know, it represents a departure to the extent that I could sort of expand on this, but to the extent that kind of repeatable communication with the souls of the dead is possible in experimental conditions in a way that is detachable from the moral states of the people who are doing the communication and is publicly visible. So it can't be reduced, say, to the visionary experiences of mystics. It's not in a dream state. It's completely devoid of moral content. That's one thing. The other thing I would say is I spaced on my answer already. Well, so the outcomes are not one unique outcome. But okay, so the other thing is, I think we'd have to kind of look at the constraints within that Islamic theological tradition, not just as coming from a position of wanting to defend something for whatever reason, but also because there's such a strong theological discipline with such strong claims that it's hard to kind of shift that around with, I mean, in other words, you can think of this as a problem from a perspective of, say, science studies, and not just a kind of a science versus religion thing, right? So imagine you have a very strong tradition of scientific inquiry, and all of a sudden somebody comes around and says, you know, we can also employ this method to justify, right, to explore something. I think because the tradition of rational speculation about God and about the relationship between God and humans and sort of the levels of reality and so on are already so developed within Shia theology that it's hard to kind of make that into an exploratory project. Where it is exploratory tends to be within the realm of visionary journeying, like in mysticism, right? So I think you're right in that there is this kind of apologetic aspect to it, but it might not be simply because that's what people are intending to. That's to be a bit more charitable towards the possibility that there is more similarity than at first might appear between a kind of an orthodox Shi'i form of engagement with scientific empiricism and, say, the more experimentally oriented New Agers. And the third part of this is that even among New Agers, there are pretty strongly articulated doctrines that they sort of justify through, you know, so there is that apologetic dimension to those two. Right? Yes?
Hi. I wanted to address the weight that you have put. It seemed to me that you are putting a lot of weight on the availability of scientific knowledge, the women getting much more educated than before, on the development of these like metaphysical experiences, whereas I would read it as a development of a particular subjectivity that is tied to an interconnection between modern attitudes and the Islamic Republic, the state. Because if we entertain this idea that it's really not just simply about them becoming much more educated, because we have to much more educated in what and relative to what. I mean, this is a question. And so in a way, then the Orthodox and the non-Orthodox in this, I think, may need to be explored, because and Japheth, geomancy, because everybody discussed that in your book, is something that is associated with the ilm of Imam Ali. So it is quite possible for this to both to come basically the intellectualist inquiries into metaphysical questions and the occult ones to both come from the same place and kind of take different paths. So, this was my...
Yeah, perfectly, I think, valid point and very well put. I think maybe how I would not contest it, but elaborate a little bit on how I see what you're saying, the kind of the production of a certain kind of subjectivity in relation to certain kinds of knowing. I would link those two and say, to think a slightly different way about ontology, right, in a kind of Ian Hacking historical ontology sense, right? There are certain modes of being that have become possible with various transformations in the 19th and 20th century. And that mode of being is tied to specific forms of knowing the human and knowing the world, including scientific knowledge, but also certain ways of working on the self, right? So that those ways of working on and producing the self produce certain kinds of capacities, right? So that's partly what I'm interested in, is some of those capacities in the sense of reasoning, right? So particular capacities for reasoning are definitely, as you're saying, connected to a particular mode of being and a particular mode of subjectivity. On the question of Jaffer and geomancy and the kind of the mixture of the scientific or the non-contradiction between the scientific and the visionary and also theologically articulated, right, in dimensions of reality. I think you're absolutely right. One thing that happens, though, with the 20th century is that there is a kind of a democratization of the idea of the Ilm, right? And knowledge, including occult knowledge, partly for infrastructural reasons, partly for educational reasons, and so on, leaving the kind of the cloisters and the limits of elite circles in a way that I think is more hospitable to a particular modern scientific way of approaching and articulating the world, and is in tension with some of those older forms. And I see some of this tension in the problems that exist in kind of scaling up from, say, the practice of Jeff or of geomancy in its more traditional kind of Hausa-based or people train in the seminary system or its kind of surrounding, its peripheries. Tensions between that and making this public in the form of, say, print, texts that circulate very widely. And I think I haven't done a lot of thinking about this, but there's something there about the transformation of the very concept of ilm too, right? Knowledge of a certain sort becoming scientific knowledge that I think has to be attended to, and I haven't done this. Yes.
My question on the concept of the global women within this realm of thinking is just in that, do you think that it's possible that or I had two questions based on it, is that one, within this sort of sphere, how do they view women within their, because obviously they're not going to use this terminology of global women to describe people in their own circles, so how do they view the kind of gender?
Sometimes they do.
Oh. Well then, and then also with that, do you find that women are sometimes drawn to it, kind of similar to your story of the self-proclaimed witch, in that they find that it's an accessible sort, and that the current society and realms of sciences that are going on is patriarchal, so that this new, or not new, but fringe way of thinking is more accessible for women, and therefore is more likely to be an accessible point for them?
So the question you're asking rests on an assumption, which is that women are more regular participants in the occult than men are. And I'm not absolutely sure that that's the case.
But that seems to be the
That's
general,
the assumption, yeah.
The assumption, but not just my own, but it seems to be the this concept of the global women.
Right.
So if that goes in.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's several. Yes, I mean definitely having restricted access, say to this is in earlier times, right? Having restricted access to learning, and having more restricted access to certain modes of sociality, right? Fostered particular circles of sociality among women themselves with their particular knowledge forms, right? So you have, in the 18th century, for example, you have this famous book by Al-Jamal Khanstadi called Aqwaid al-Nisa, The Beliefs of Women, where it's all about mocking kind of the superstitious, quote-unquote, practice. He doesn't use that word. Later, he's read to be representing the superstitious practices of women, and bonds of sisterhood and vows and so on and so forth. And it's clear that he's working, what he's doing, what Khanstadi is doing there, and Catherine Babayan has written about this, is essentially to identify, delimit, and then disparage a particular mode of sociality that emerges because of the particular gender relations in Isfahan of the 18th century. Right? And I think some of that still persists even up to the present time. The question for me, though, is that those modes of sociality haven't stayed the same, right? And their boundaries have not been solid, right? So there's been all kinds of reformulations of those things, and yet that image still remains, right? I mean, one way of kind of identifying it is a really boring way of just saying it's bigotry, it's misogyny, which is that, right? And it has no basis in reality or whatever, right? What I'm interested in is asking although the sort of the terminology stays the same, can we unproblematically take that terminology and think that, necessarily assume that it refers to the same kind of social reality, the same kind of power dynamics, right? So that, I think, has shifted somewhat, even though there are obviously elements that persist in this. Yes?
Thank you very much for this very interesting talk. I just wonder about the role of language itself. So if we consider sort of modern science and sort of the metaphysics as two sort of clusters, so the contact is done by language itself. So then, rather than the direct intervention of modern science to explain and supernatural, can we talk about the primary role intervention of language that has been already rationalized in explaining the supernatural?
That's very interesting. Can you say more about how language was rationalized?
Well, so in your case, this is Persian or another language. So these languages, the capacity in terms of vocabulary and in terms of the language processing, these languages are modernized. And the needs of these languages also rationalized in one sense. So, for instance, like words, their meanings changed over time. So maybe language itself might be primary role, because so there is a phenomenon and they try to explain it, and the only tool that they can do is language itself. And then maybe we are bound by the capacity of the language that we use.
That's super interesting. I think we were having a conversation about something that I think connects to this in a way. I have less to say about the change in language itself than the kind of sort of transformation in situations of utterance and forms of address that maybe kind of connects to this a bit. Not so much rationalization as the emergence of print publics, right, from the early 20th century onwards, and really what is shared between the dissemination of theological reason and the popularization of scientific knowledge is print publics. Many of these being essentially periodicals, later on magazines, and then newspapers and so on. So you have, and this connects back to the issue of literacy, you have increasingly all kinds of knowledge being placed within the same kinds of circulations of address, right? And I'm drawing on Michael Warner's work a little bit here on publics and counterpublics. So this idea that publics come into existence through the address, through an actual enunciation, right? And the fact that the addressees are increasingly the same communities, and there is increasingly a kind of a standardization of language, and there are standardization of capacities. People can read, people know how to read periodicals, right? There's a temporality of reading, there's a certain kind of ability to read in private, and then there are particular norms of response, right? Writing criticisms or thank yous, or photocopying and giving to your friends or whatever. So I think that's one way that I would answer this. Yes.
So maybe also kind of follows a little bit on that question, where the kind of mood so far has been standardization of language, or sort of taming of this occult language, these practices. But then when it comes to sort of the political aspect of these practices, I was hoping maybe you could talk more about how the political and the rational is parasitical on these practices, right? It might not actually be through the domain of spoken language, but even if I look, if you look at practices around the world, like politics in India right now, I know it's a very different context, but there are like God men, right, who have organized, and hypnosis, trance, possession, these things are not apart from these groups of people who have been assembled, in a place like the Northwest and Punjab, and who actually become literal vote banks, right? So these God men do have links to, whatever, in the majoritarian state right now, but it's always been there, you know, even in the secular kind of version of this. You know, so I feel like the thrust has been one way, but we haven't seen how these practices also kind of give energy to rational formations.
Mm-hmm. To political formations?
Political or, you know, I don't know what kind of constituency you want to talk about it as.
So there's a problem of heterogeneity that I have to deal with, and you know, depending on where the emphasis is put, I think you can draw different conclusions. So if we're looking at, say, a period after the end of the war with Iraq, when all these alternative spiritual practices begin to emerge, right? There is a certain kind of politics or political possibility that I think emerges. Well, there's a few. One of them, I think, is the rise of a kind of a dangerous indifference towards politics that is focused on self-care and kind of spiritual self-fashioning out there, right? But that's already something that's contained to a good extent, I think, in the liberalization post-war, and then the increasing emphasis on self-enrichment to the benefit of, you know, the kind of the private vice that is public virtue, to the benefit of the state or the nation. But then there's a different political, I think, possibility that also emerges through kind of a negation, which is that the response to these alternative spiritual formations has required, through the development of polemical discourse, a new kind of boundary setting between the orthodox and the unorthodox, right? So actually, to get back to an earlier question about Professor Abisab's question about orthodoxy and non-orthodoxy, I mean, or the heterodox, there's a period in the earlier 2000s when it's hard to look at something like the language of chakras or karma or energies and so on within Shi'i discourse and say that it's heterodox, right? I mean, as an analyst, I can look at it and say, this is super weird, but I can't say that it's heterodox because nobody else is saying that it's heterodox, right? But then there's a point, and I think this is where that political possibility emerges, or a closure of sorts, when all of a sudden people say, wait a minute, this smells of Hinduism, right? Or it smells of the New Age, or Satanism, or whatever. And then, you know, these boundary-making kind of practices have to come in, and then a line has to be drawn between not just what is orthodoxy and what is not orthodox, but also what is scientific and what is non-scientific. So you have at the same time interesting kind of discourses about pseudoscience, right? There are secularists who came out and said, look, so there's this website that's modeled on Snopes. It's called Gomane. And what they do is they attacked cosmic mysticism, for example, and they said, look, people are free to believe whatever they want to believe as far as we're concerned, but none of this is science. And they just wrote extensive kind of debunkings, right? And that was something that was a relatively new development as far as spiritual practice was concerned. And it generates a particular, I think, political field of tensions. Yes?
I want to ask a question that kind of also relates to what Professor Islam said in relation to this formation of subjectivity and the relationship to the state. And I was wondering whether, and also because you mentioned that a lot of these practices kind of also have a home in the diaspora, in places like Los Angeles, etc. I was wondering whether you also did ethnographic work there or not, and how these categories of Galway women, etc., also resonate in the diaspora.
The answer is no, unfortunately. I did a tiny bit of, well, one interview with a master in Vienna who was a cosmic mystic, and I had contacts with people in LA, but I never actually did extensive field work. One thing from historical study in earlier, so I'll say two things. in an earlier period when Spiritism took off in Iran among elites, there was a gendered discourse about mediumship that was very much inherited, I think, from French and wider European practice, which argued that women, because of their nature, are more susceptible to contact with souls, and they make better mediums. They're more sensitive, and so on. Right? There's actually work on this in the European context, which also, even though it kind of begins with a period of from a position of frailty, it also makes possible a certain kind of power, right? Because by being a medium, you also then thus speak for the spiritual. With the cosmic mystics, what I found interesting was there's also a kind of an inversion of the gullibility discourse in saying that, I've heard this repeatedly, masters saying women are particularly good at mysticism. They're better than men at mysticism, right? So it was basically the same discourse, but inverted, right? And made into a virtue and a strength of women. To say this was not their failure, it was actually their success. Yes?
There are several issues. The first question is, why didn't you give us any examples of gullible men? Thinking in the same way, because as an Iranian who's been familiar with Anthropology and all these things happening in Iran today, I could replace your examples, of women or of men as well. I do not see any, gender relations specifically in your examples. Then I refer to what you cited from one of these mullahs saying that only the gullible women and the young men would be attracted to such schools of mysticism. So somehow, the men who might be attracted to such schools are somehow reasoned because they are young and unexperienced. But women in general, they are gullible. And I think it's better to search a little bit more profoundly into the culture of misogyny that exists not only in the Iranian culture, but also in the, let's say, Arabic culture, in the Balkan culture, in monotheism in general, which survives even today in Latin culture, that considers women as gullible, as you said, Sadalo, irrational, not as or let's say full of guiles and tricks, makrazana. We have a huge textual production about women's guiles and tricks in Persian, in Arabic, also in Indian sources, that could be the source for such misogynistic attitude or let's say pessimistic attitude towards women. And even in Zoroastrian sources, we have Jahika, the daughter of Ahriman, who is named as Jahika the Jar man, the trickster woman, the magician woman, who is somehow related to exorcism and, let's say,
Yeah. So, well, good question. I mean, for the first part, why didn't I name gullible men? I mean, that's not my appellation, right? It's what's available in public discourse. I've never heard people say gullible men as a type, right? I mean, the social type tends to be zanan و دختران صادقه, right? That's and even the notion of javanan, which was in this context, I mean, that was pretty much idiosyncratic. I mean, most of the time it's zanan و دختران صادقه. Of course, I mean, I don't think gullibility at all is a useful, is a useful descriptor in any case. I mean, I wouldn't call any of these people gullible. I'm saying they're all rational. So it's basically because that discourse doesn't, as far as I know, doesn't exist. On the issue of misogyny and kind of the idea about Nabas al-Al and so on, I think that's definitely true. I'm less interested though in where the kind of the ultimate source of these things are and as why the shift, right? So I mean, there's things that are in common between the early 20th century and the late 20th century. I'm more interested in what the difference is, right? So that's why I didn't talk about that so much. And where that misogynistic discourse exists, there's also a pretty wide variety. I mean, you have on the issue of Nabas al-Al, I mean, you hear that in popular discourse, but then you go to the jurists or you go to the philosophers, and there's, I mean, already from is it? I think it's Plato, right? And the kind of Platonism, this idea that if humans are defined by reason, then women cannot be half reason because then they're not humans, right? There's this kind of species differentia, and I'm not versed in that language, kind of issue, right? And that persists in philosophical discourse. Women are not, in most kind of sophisticated philosophical discourse, constitutionally any different from men in terms of their capacities for reasoning. And there's quite a bit of actually argumentation from a different side, from thinking about say legal prohibitions or legal disenfranchisement in terms of sociological considerations rather than psychological or essentialist considerations, right? So Muhammad Fadl has this famous article, Two Women, One Man, right, about sort of testimony in court and why is the difference between is the equation of two women with one man due to some consideration of essential characteristics of men and women in Islamic jurisprudence, or are there other things involved? And he makes the case that there's actually sociological considerations and a fair bit of material that he looks at. So I'm also wary of making too strong a claim about that when there's really a pretty wide range of ways of considering that, even though you're absolutely right, misogyny is definitely part of it.
Are you translating the word sade as well?
So no.
Oh, okay, I didn't hear it said. Thank you.
That's it. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.